So once again, welcome tonight. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us in 3 minutes or less. This is one of the, of course, the rules, as you know, is to keep it under 3 minutes or 3 minutes at most. And that's hard to do when you've been working a lot on these projects, but I know you can do it. And we have Sarah from the Dean's office who will make sure that we're keeping on task too. I appreciate Sarah for her help in getting this organized and also providing some refreshments after we present and while the judges work diligently on the scoring. I do want to recognize our three judges, Dr. Jeff Hill from School of Family Life, and Dr. David Wood from Social Work, School of Social Work, and also Rebecca Matheson from Psychology and Neuroscience in the back. So they'll be watching carefully, and they're looking forward to learning from you as well. In terms of rules, we should probably put up the order of presenters. This is the order that we'll have tonight, and so we'll call each person up to get set up and make sure that the judges are ready to start. And then when we have the signal, we'll have Sarah start the clock. She has signs here for a 1 minute warning and a 30-second warning, just to help you as you go along, so you know where you're at in terms of time. So keep an eye on her, and when the bell rings, you can't say anything out after that point. So make sure that you keep track of it. And I'm sure you've read the rules. Make sure you don't wear any costumes. I don't see any costumes here. And no rap songs, no poems, no musical instruments, and no laboratory equipment. So make sure you follow those rules because I know they'll be really strict at that at the university level. For those that don't know, we have 3 awards that we'll give for the top 3 presenters. The first place award is for $450, the second place is $325, and the third is $225. And the first place winner, we only get to send one from our college to the university competition, which is next week on the 7th. So the top presenter will go to that competition next week to compete for several $1,000s and $5,000. So that's a big deal there. So we want you all to do well tonight. Are there any questions of me or about the rules before we get started and get into it? All right, we'll go ahead and ask Ryan McLean to come down and probably stand over here. We're filming this tonight, so you'll be famous at some point. And so if you can stand over this side of the screen would be great. And then you can keep an eye over here on Sarah.
When my wife and I finished Wreck-It Ralph 2, she turned to me and said, "That was so cute, but it's going to be so out of date in like 10 years. And I responded by saying, "Yeah, by the time our 3-month-old son gets to be a teenager, everything in that movie is going to be just as out of date as a floppy disk." Our parents had no way of preparing for social media and the internet trends that we see today. But I think that they've been pretty successful in the way that they've handled it. So as a parenting researcher, I wanted to find out how parents are handling things and what they're saying. So in a sample of 1,155 adolescents aged 10 to 18, I looked at the way the parents were talking about media and these general media trends. I combined it with this matrix that has active versus restrictive. So active is discussion-based conversations about media, and restrictive is less than that. And then style is autonomy supportive versus controlling. In terms of general media trends, I found that social media and video games were associated with more anxiety and depression, with video games being worse for boys than for girls, possibly because they play more violent video games and they tend to play those video games more often. In terms of parenting, I found that parents who gave their children space to wiggle, so they had freedom to choose what to do with their media time, but they did have firm limits, had the best outcomes, and they had lower screen time. I also found that parents who were generally autonomy supportive, who gave their children that wiggle room, had less anxiety and depression. So what does this actually look like? This would look like a conversation between a father and son. Son, you have 60 minutes of screen time tonight. You can choose what you want to do with that, whether that's social media, video games, texting, whatever it is you want to do, as long as that media does not surpass the sex and violence standards that you and I agreed upon last week. This gave their children a sense of control and trust that allowed the teen to make their own decision and make that decision well. So what does this all mean? This means that parents can act as a protective wall against the negative effects of media. They can teach their children how to engage in critical thinking and let their children make these decisions that will help them have a better life and improve the way that they interact with and take in the media messages. Thank you.
We'll let the judges finish their judging, but you're welcome to come up, Zach. Okay. But we won't start until they're ready.
Okay. Worldwide, nearly 800,000 people die by suicide each year. In the United States, rates of suicide increased by nearly 30% since 1999. Clearly, suicide is a large and growing issue. We need to identify modifiable risk factors that we can treat in order to slow this epidemic. Insomnia, or trouble falling asleep and staying asleep, is a risk factor for suicide. You may wonder why that is. Think of someone that you know or know of that is suicidal. They may feel as if they're hopeless. They may feel as if they're a burden to others, especially their friends and family. And they may feel as if they don't belong. They may even be embarrassed or confused about their suicidal thoughts. And you can imagine that by the end of the day, they're absolutely exhausted by these feelings. But guess what? When they lay down to go to bed, they're so worked up by these thoughts that they can't fall asleep. Instead, they're left to lay there and agonize over these thoughts. Sleep is a way of restarting and refreshing that many of us may take for granted. So, in order to more clearly link insomnia to varying levels of suicidality, we collected data from 194 deceased patients from a mental health facility here in Utah. Using their medical records and their death records, we placed them into one of four groups that you can see here. No suicidality, only suicidal thoughts, previous suicide attempt, and an actual completed suicide. We then looked at their self-reported levels of insomnia, pulling an item from the outcomes questionnaire. What we found was that increased severity of insomnia was associated with greater suicidality. So much so that insomnia was actually a better predictor of suicide than actual suicidal thoughts. In other words, if you were a clinician and had somebody come in who had insomnia, they would be at greater risk of completing a suicide than someone who came to you for suicidal thoughts only. So, where do we go from here? Patients who are suicidal may be much more willing to disclose their symptoms of insomnia rather than suicidality, because it's much less stigmatizing. Our hope is that clinicians will note these symptoms of insomnia and target them for treatment. Doing so may result in a reduction of suicidality and perhaps save lives. Thank you.
I'd like to tell you about my friends, RJ and KJ. RJ was walking late one night, and a week later, he ended up in the hospital as a John Doe. According to the brain scans, doctors figured that somebody took a bat to the back of his head. While in the hospital, he completed many tests, including some motor tests in which doctors judged how well he could move. He also completed physical therapy, but when he left the hospital, he was unable to return to his job in masonry because he lacked the coordination and the balance to be able to be up on high scaffolds laying bricks. KJ is a hockey player, and during one of his games, he took an elbow to the head, left him a little bit dazed. He was able to return to the game, but ever since then, his reaction time and his movement speed have been slower. Sadly, JR and KJ are examples of why traumatic brain injury is one of the leading causes of disability in the world. And thousands of cases like theirs show how brain injury rehabilitation is falling short. See, what happens is a standard of care is to get a snapshot of the brain if the injury is severe enough to warrant it, and then do some clinical movement tests, and then standard therapy is prescribed. Alas, brain injury is unique and requires custom therapy. The problem with these traditional tests is that they miss the subtleties and the complexities of the injury, and they fail to give a proper picture of the movement impairment. Fortunately, we live in an age of technology. For my thesis, for my research, we paired advanced neuroimaging with a motion capture device created for gamers, and created a motor assessment that accurately measures the movement of the fingers and the hands while patients take a movement test. And we link those tests to injuries that we see in the brain, like broken connections. With the advanced neuroimaging and the movement assessment, doctors now have a clearer picture to create customized rehabilitation so that RJ and KJ can return to work and play. Thank you.
Imagine you're late for a job interview. You're driving down the road, it's blizzarding, and then you get a flat tire. At this moment, your body is experiencing automatic physiological reactions. For example, your blood pressure increases, your immune system slows down, and your pupils dilate. These processes are called stress responses. Overwhelming evidence has linked stress to the development and progression of health complications. Now imagine the same situation, except instead of driving alone, you have your best friend or your spouse in the passenger seat. My research investigates how having someone with you while experiencing a stressful event changes these stress responses. Pupillometry, or the measurement of pupil size, can capture the physiological response to stress almost instantaneously. The pupils dilate within 200 milliseconds of stress exposure. And although previous work has examined pupil dilation as a stress response, no one had yet investigated whether investigating pupil dilation as a stress response, no one had yet investigated whether having someone with you while experiencing a stressful event changes these pupil dilation stress responses. In order to study this question, I recruited married couples to participate in an experiment. I randomly assigned couples to come to my lab, either together or individually, and to complete a stress task. While they completed the stress task, I used an infrared camera to measure their pupil size. Results from this experiment show that indeed, having a spouse with you while experiencing a stressor reduces or dampens pupil dilation compared to experiencing a stressor alone. This finding is consistent with other methods, such as blood pressure. However, this novel finding shows that the dampening effects are immediate, something only theorized up until now. My research demonstrates how quickly marriage can be beneficial in the face of stressors and identifies an innovative pathway to investigate pupil dilation as a stress response. From this discovery, I find myself with even more questions. For example, would we see the same results if it wasn't your spouse in the experiment with you, but a friend, an acquaintance, maybe even a frenemy? Is relationship quality an important factor in this stress response? And what if the stressor was, in fact, breaking down on the side of the road in a blizzard, or watching a scary movie, or giving a 3-minute thesis? These are just some of the questions I'll be pursuing, using the eye to glimpse our health.
It doesn't take a psychologist to understand that there are major differences between individual and group therapy. Yet, despite these differences, the research has found traditionally that between the two therapies, there's no difference in attrition rates, in dropout rates, in improvement rates, and in acceptance rates. So we have this well-established no difference conclusion between individual and group therapy. For my thesis, I did a replication study. That's right, a replication study. And that's because the original study, done in 2017, found some very unexpected results. And these are results that, quite frankly, are game changers for the way we would view group versus individual therapy should they be replicated with new data. It all revolves around this thing we call not on track alerts. Most clinics require that patients take a 45-item questionnaire before each therapy session. And this is to measure their level of distress. A higher score on this questionnaire means more distress. And with that, obviously the goal of therapy is to decrease the score over time. Now, if someone suddenly has a spike in their score between therapy sessions, the therapist gets a not on track alert, which is important because it's telling them that their client is at high risk for treatment failure, which means they'll drop out of treatment sooner, feeling worse than when they started. No one wants that. The original study found something strange with these not on track alerts. Looking at over 400 patients in group therapy, they found that 33.5% had at least one of these not on track alerts during the course of treatment. That's a lot, especially because they found that only 18% of individual therapy clients had one of these not on track alerts in the same clinics. For my study, I gathered data from a few different clinics, thousands of different patients, same time period, and I found that, first I hypothesized that I would not find a difference because this idea that group produces so many more alerts than individuals seemed bizarre. But contrary to my hypothesis, and consistent with the original study, I found that, as seen right here, 32% of group therapy patients had at least one not on track error, where at least only 22% of individual patients had one of these alerts, and this is significant. And it means you are 143% more likely to alert as not on track just because you are in group therapy, because I controlled for everything else. These findings are significant, and they really change the way that we approach group versus individual therapy, because it's a novel idea that group therapy would produce so many more wins. Thank you.
This is a man from the Congo named Leonard Bogalwa. At the age of 17, Leonard was kidnapped and forced to join the rebel army. After 6 months and a miraculous escape, he returned home to find that 2 of his brothers had been shot and killed by the rebels. Fearing that he would meet the same fate, his mother took him to a Catholic priest who smuggled Leonard out of the country. He would spend the next 6 years in refugee camps alone. There are over 65 million people worldwide who, like Leonard, have been forced to leave their homes because of violence or persecution. Those of us in this room live in very different circumstances, which puts us in a position to help. But will we? My research aimed to capture what might motivate individuals to offer help to refugees. The results were fascinating and personally very humbling. I gathered data from 235 American adults. In an examination of this group, I found an important difference between those who offered help to refugees and those who didn't. It's called state empathy. State empathy is related to, but distinct from, what we call trait empathy, which is more of a personality characteristic. State empathy is situational. It involves feelings that are triggered by exposure to a person or group who's suffering. In my research, I found that those who reported higher levels of trait empathy, in other words, those who considered themselves to be generally sensitive to the needs of others, were no more likely to offer help to refugees than those who reported lower levels of trait empathy. Those who offered help were different in that they reported higher levels of state empathy, or feelings of concern towards refugees specifically. What does this mean? It means that the helpers had likely been exposed to sufficient information or experiences that had triggered feelings of empathy towards refugees. But I believe that this principle would extend past the refugee population. While trait empathy is important, feelings of empathy triggered by exposure to a person who's suffering may be more powerful in motivating us to help. So, my commitment and my suggestion to you is this: learn all that you can about people who may be suffering, victims of bullying, abuse, or trafficking, individuals who experience homelessness, mental illness, or addiction, immigrants, and refugees. After 6 years in refugee camps, Leonard was resettled in the United States. He's the founder of Utah Valley Refugees, an organization here in Provo that helps refugees, 88 families and counting, to find homes and build lives in our communities. Leonard's life was saved by good people who recognized that he needed help. It's my hope that we can do the same for others. Thank you.
Teenage alcohol use is a major human health problem in the United States. There are a number of health and psychological consequences associated with alcoholism, and it is especially toxic to the developing brain. Teenagers are not known for their good decision making, and they consume over 90% of their alcohol in the form of binge drinking. One big risk factor for alcoholism is anxiety. This is thought to be because alcohol has anxiety-reducing properties. So, for example, drinking 2 glasses of wine is comparable to taking a Valium or a Xanax. Anxiety is also a temperament trait, which means that it is biologically based and stable across time. This means that if you were an anxious baby, you were probably an anxious teenager, and you're probably an anxious adult right now. My thesis asks the question, can we test an infant for anxiety and then use that test to predict a teenager's propensity for alcohol consumption? Well, because it's illegal and unethical to experimentally distribute alcohol to a human teenager, we use a non-human primate model. Rhesus monkeys are a good model because they have genetic and temperament similarities to humans. They age 3 times as quickly, and when given access to alcohol, they will drink. At 2 weeks of life, we tested 145 rhesus monkey infants for behavior and brain development that are indicative of anxiety. This test is comparable to a routine test given to human infants in the early months of life. It's non-invasive and it's mainly a test of reflexes. So we test for things like the rooting reflex, or whether they can follow a light with their eyes, or whether or not the toes curl when you stroke the bottom of the foot. Remember, whenever you're testing reflexes, you're really testing brain development. 3 to 4 years later, when subjects were adolescents, we gave them access to alcohol. They could choose to drink sweetened alcohol or Kool-Aid for a period of 7 weeks. Results from this study confirmed that indeed, a test of reflexes and brain development at just 2 weeks of life is predictive of adolescent alcohol intake. Those monkeys that showed the poorest reflexes and the poorest brain development at 2 weeks old drank the most alcohol. In fact, they drink a lot of alcohol, in some cases consuming a daily blood alcohol limit of almost 3 times the legal limit in humans. The results of this study suggest that an early test of reflexes and brain development in human infants is predictive of teenage alcohol use. These findings are ultimately important because they help us identify the biological foundations of alcoholism, and they help us develop effective treatment measures for teenagers at risk. Thank you.
Immigration. When I say that word, what comes to mind? Most of us probably conjure up images of big, beautiful walls and caravans of people crossing the Mexican-American border. You probably don't picture people like my African neighbors who are from Ghana. We met them just as I was beginning research on African immigrants. They invited us over for some homemade fufu, and we helped them navigate the ins and outs of living in Provo. As I interacted with this brave family and began my research, I couldn't help but wonder what it was like to be in their shoes. So I took data from 409 African immigrants representing 31 different countries, and I wanted to know how discrimination affected their mental health and coping strategies amongst us in their communities. I started with discrimination, and I found that almost half of these people experienced extreme harassment and threat, while most of them experienced some other form of disrespect. Many of them were able to find hope and comfort in their spiritual beliefs and social support. But if an individual felt intense discrimination, they often had nowhere to turn to, and they were 3 times more likely to turn to alcohol and other substances to cope. Those who reached out to their community were often able to find reduced mental distress, but not all African immigrants have communities that they can reach out to. 137% is the amount of increase in African immigration from 2005 to 2013, and it continues to rise. With African immigration on the rise, we need to do something about this. We can provide resources that hone in on what people like James, Emma, and their kids find most useful when coping. We can help them turn towards positive coping styles, such as reaching out to friends, rather than the maladaptive type, such as drinking and drugs. At the very least, we can be that friend they turn towards. No matter what our political stance, we can develop cultural humility and accept all immigrants, creating a healing space where their unique experiences can be better understood. And as they begin to thrive, so will we as a national community. Thank you.
Let's take a trip 1,000 years into the future. Archaeologists have come across round, shiny objects that we commonly call CDs, but they don't know what they are and what significance they would have had to our culture. None of our records have survived for them to be able to understand the significance they would have had, and they are trying to determine whether or not these are significant or even worth studying, which could be sad because they would miss out on some of our past traditions and memories that are held on CDs, especially the Beatles. So, to relate this to archaeologists working in Utah, they come across commonly found objects that are made of stone, and these are called stone balls. The Fremont peoples who made these stone balls lived during the time period of 1000 AD to 1300 AD. Stone balls come in different sizes and shapes, and were usually made through taking a stone and striking it into a round shape, and then taking another stone and smoothing them to an almost perfectly spherical shape. These round stone balls vary differently, but usually when they are found, they are labeled, sent to a museum where they're kept, and then mentioned in site reports. And when they are actually mentioned in a book or in some kind of a greater report, they're said to have the same purpose, and therefore it's solved. My thesis is to look at how these stone balls vary, and I use several methods to determine their sizes, colors, and different patterns that might exist among these stone spheres. And I found that they actually are used for 4 different purposes. One was for grinding, which I find flat spots on the surface of the spheres. 2, they were used for cooking, and I find evidence of sooting and burn marks. 3, they were used for gaming implements, like throwing our gaming balls, and that is seen through a perfectly round shape. And 4, multi-purpose. They were used for all of those purposes, and I'll see all of those characteristics on the stone sphere to make up that last category. Understanding more about these stone balls and looking at their differences can give us insights into understanding more about Fremont peoples and the different daily activities they would have taken place in. Thank you.
Have you ever heard a father say something along the lines of, their mother is just better at taking care of kids than I am? Or whenever I try to help out around the house with folding the laundry or doing the dishes, she always fixes what I've done, so it's just easier to let her do it all. Have you ever heard a mother say something along the lines of, women are just better at taking care of children than men? Or their father wouldn't know the first thing about how to run the house. That's my job. This is what maternal gatekeeping sounds like. Maternal gatekeeping is when a mother determines how and when a father is involved in the home and with their children. It often leads to decreased father involvement and engagement, which is not good for child development. I've seen examples of this in my own life, specifically with my sister. One day, I was at her house helping her make dinner. Her husband, who struggles with depression and anxiety, had been locked in their bedroom for 3 straight days, ignoring their 2-year-old crying for him at the door. When he finally emerged, all 4 of their children came running to him, saying, "Dad, can we play?" And he said, "Yes, let's go outside and let's play." And that's when my sister stepped in. "No," she said. "It's time for the kids to do their chores." And then she instructed her husband to sit on the couch and wait until dinner was ready. That is maternal gatekeeping. It got me thinking, is it possible that a father's mental health could influence the severity of a mother's gatekeeping behaviors? So I examined this connection in self-reports of over 2,000 fathers in the United States, and I found that as reports of depression increased, reports of experiencing maternal gatekeeping also increased. What does this mean? It means that when dad is depressed, it's likely that mom is determining his involvement in the home by utilizing gatekeeping behaviors. Why does this matter? It matters because my sister matters. Her husband matters. And their experiences are not uncommon, they're simply understudied. Historically, maternal gatekeeping and paternal depression have been viewed as isolated problems, but my results show that they are interconnected and should be addressed as such. My sister and her husband are now working on ways to improve the balance of control in their home in a way that's healthy for them and for their children. The key really is that this is something that is happening and needs to be addressed and discussed. That's the only way that it can be resolved in the home. Thank you.
The average life expectancy for an individual with autism is 36 years. That's half the life expectancy of the general population. This is nothing short of shocking. Yet autism itself is not responsible for this rate of premature death. Rather, it is the large number of mental and physical health challenges that they face, as indicated by the blue bars on the slide. For example, individuals with autism are 10 times more likely to suffer from epilepsy and 9 times more likely to attempt to commit suicide. Similarly, about 90% of individuals with autism have a diagnosable psychiatric condition, compared to only 25% in the general population. This leads to vastly increased medical costs, long-term medication use, and increased medical visits. Research and public health organizations have long documented this disparity. However, an important question remains. If poor physical and mental health and not autism are responsible for this decreased life expectancy, then what is responsible for this poor physical and mental health? The natural place to look are things that affect the health of the general population. My research looks at 2 of these factors, sleep and loneliness. First, sleep. About 1/3 of US adults get less than the recommended 7 hours of sleep per night, many of whom I'm sure are in this room. This means that these individuals are at risk of increased mortality, impaired cognitive function, and many chronic illnesses, including cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Unfortunately, sleep difficulties are twice as common in individuals with autism. And even when they are able to get to sleep, this sleep is often less restorative and less efficient. This causes difficulties not only for these individuals, but for families, employers, and so on. Second, loneliness. The former Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, described loneliness as a silent epidemic. As many as 40% of adults in the US describe themselves as lonely. Being lonely has as much impact on our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Furthermore, individuals with autism have an innate difficulty with social situations. This makes them at even more risk for these increased health challenges. I believe that sleep and loneliness account for a large amount of this physical and mental health difficulties. Using actigraphy watches, which are basically souped up Fitbits, like this one in the picture, to monitor their sleep, and by understanding their experience of loneliness, we can help understand how these factors affect them. This can help us provide treatment and interventions to help target these and to, most importantly, increase their life expectancy. Their lives are too short. We can help.
All right, before I announce the awards, I do want to ask that you give our 3 judges a round of applause for their work. And they did a really good job, and they were serious about trying to come up with the best ones here, and that's it was hard because we have a lot of good 3-minute thesis presentations tonight. I also want to please recognize Sarah for her work in putting this together as well. So thank you. All right, so once again, we have the three winners will receive a cash prize from the college. And please talk to me afterwards, and we'll make sure you get your information or I can contact you later so you can get the information to our college controller to get you paid. So for our third place winner is Claire Thomas from the School of Family Life. Right here. Okay. Right here. Very good. Our second place winner is Elizabeth Wood from psychology. And our first place winner is Carly Palmer from the School of Family Life. Congratulations, all three of you. And Carly, you'll be in the university competition next week. So get prepared for that, and I'll be turning your name in, and don't be nervous. You can't do that. So anyway, I'd like to please to congratulate all of you in the work that you did and your research, and I hope that your theses and dissertations and your projects all come out well as you continue forward. Thanks for being part of this, and have a good night. Thanks.